All right, welcome everyone and to another Worksighted Next webinar. My name is Adam Deveraux.
Hey, and I'm Jordan Briney, one of our remote support engineers here. Welcome to Season 2. 2020 brings a new year for us for our webinars. We figured new season, new year, with a lot of new production that we're putting into it, alongside with a lot of new cool topics that we hope to bring to you guys along the table.
Yeah, so we're committed to a monthly schedule for these. We've gotten a lot of great feedback. We're really looking for new ways to engage with the larger base and spread a lot of information. It's really, there's so much changing in IT. There's so many things to try to keep up with. So we're hoping to consolidate some of that and really get it in a more easy to follow and concise manner. So if this is a format that you like, make sure to let us know. And if you have any ideas for us, go ahead and send them our way.
Yeah, and today's webinar is going to be a lot about, given the experience and knowledge that we've seen from our side of the things, we would like to bring to you kind of what we found to be the top 3 IT security threats that are facing Michigan businesses in 2020 today. So again, given from what we've seen in our industry and patterns we've noticed from Michigan, we'll see if we can pull stuff together.
Yeah, so like a lot of top 10, top 3 lists in this case.
Yep.
You know, everybody has different opinions, but this is based off from what we're experiencing and things that we really think you should think about. But we want to lay a little groundwork on that and talk about why security is changing. There's just a couple quick points. One is in regards to the fact that a lot of organizations are in kind of a hybrid cloud model now, where you have a lot of your business information, and that's one of the things we're going to continue to talk about is what do you want to think about protecting? And a lot of times it's your critical business information and systems. So people will try to exploit you, will try to ransom. There's lots of ways that they will try to either use that information or lock that information down. We'll go into that more. But that information is now in lots of different places. And there's kind of an older security model that a lot of us still think in, and it's still true to some degree. And it's kind of like the walled garden, right? It's when you have a trusted network, a firewalled perimeter. So you can think of the diagram of an old school model as you've got your brick wall and then everything's inside. But once you were over that wall, then you were trusted, right? Once you're inside the network, now you have access to just about everything. Now that's changing because a lot of the information is outside of that network and your user identities are in lots of different systems, lots of different cloud systems. So the challenge there is how do we move to a model that protects us in that reality? And what's kind of developed by others, not by us, is a concept called zero trust. And that's where you move from that walled garden that once you're inside, now you're a trusted member of the information space, to lots of different devices, lots of different users, lots of different connections, lots of different systems that information is stored into it. And moving it to where it's more an awareness of lots of security signals. So it's a system that constantly is looking at and verifying users. It's more device-based, so what devices are users accessing from, and can we trust it? Do we have information on it? So it's looking a lot of different signals and inputs as to whether or not that access is a trusted access. So it gets a little weedy, but the point is, we kind of have to change our mindset to some degree as we look at security. And a big thing really comes down to that user identity and the business information management.
Yep. As our industry becomes ever evolving, a lot of our applications will start moving outside of that wall. So again, this is where zero trust really needs to be in play. Sometimes, and we'll touch base on this as the webinar goes along, some things we have to protect from an application, from a server side, from a cloud side, in order to make sure that we can get everything set the way they would like to. Do we want to go ahead and touch base and start getting in number 3?
Yeah, let's start with that.
Okay, so number 3, what we found here is to really be a pattern of, generally speaking, outdated systems. One of the things is that people start finding ways to get into the walled garden, as we use as the analogy, by finding ways of systems, operating systems, software that are typically out of date, unpatched, and untouched here is usually what we found out.
Yeah, and the reality there is that one of the reasons why we want to talk about this and why it's relevant right now in particular is because of Windows 7 end of life from Microsoft and Server 2008 and 2008 R2 end of life. And what that means is that Microsoft will no longer be producing patches, security updates for those operating systems for most users. So over time, as security vulnerabilities are found, which they are constantly in all software, those won't get fixed. And so it means that those devices are more vulnerable and more likely to get infected in ways that you can't necessarily control through user behavior or through what you're doing with that PC. So that's a significant issue right now for a lot of enterprises. There's a lot of Windows 7 devices out there still. There's a lot of Windows 2008 R2 servers out there. It's just important to note that this is a real problem, and it is something that you have to figure out. We have to figure out how to address and make sure that we have a proactive replacement plan for those
Yep.
type of systems.
And it isn't necessarily all just Windows 7 and 2008. You can have Windows 10 systems that have flaws and outbreaks in it as well, which is important to make sure that you keep scheduled and a consistent patch schedule, excuse me, to be able to put that all together here. Because we found that even in Windows 10 as a good example of it, prior versions are no longer supported, and those could lead to gaps and holes that could lead into bigger problems for us.
Right, or other software.
Yes.
And the other thing that we put in there was IoT, other network devices. This is exacerbated by the fact that our old security model, again, not walled garden, once you have an infected thing inside of the network, oftentimes you're able to pivot and go on to larger and larger attacks. So we see there's been a lot of video cameras that had issues. There's talk of printers and other devices that you may not think about from an updating the software standpoint or the way that you secure those devices from people accessing them. But it can be a way to get into that network where they can continue to exploit.
Yeah, and especially being, it could even be things to your point about printers and stuff. It could be something to maybe not necessarily the software behind it, but the firmware. Again, any hole that potentially is left open that is discovered, that's the intent of patching, is so that we're able to put ourselves in positions to allow us to be able to prevent from getting into complicated situations or easy patch windows, or excuse me, holes that we find along our circle here.
Yeah, so a good example of that is the SMB1 vulnerabilities that were discovered, like in Windows XP a few years back. There were major organizations that were using Windows XP still, and it allowed one compromised computer to go and infect all the rest of the computers that had that vulnerability unpatched that were Windows XP. So those are the kind of cascading infections and problems that we want to try to avoid by making sure that our systems are supported, up to date as much as possible, that they're unsupported versions, and that we have a way of getting those updates from manufacturers. And if there are devices that we don't really trust, or they don't need access to everything, then we want to try to minimize what they can get into. And so that's where you start going into zero trust. Also means only the access that you need at any given time, right? Don't open it all up. And you can think about this even from a user standpoint. They shouldn't be able to get access to all files and folders. Let's make sure that the permissions that they have are appropriate for what they need to do.
Yep, exactly. Now, the part that we want to touch base on, just to finish this off here, is how in an outdated system environment, how do we properly protect this organization then? If we do find, as we do assessments, that maybe they are running either Windows 7 environments or firmware is out of date, what do we do to protect these organizations here?
Yeah, so I think that brings us to number 2, which is ransomware and malware. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll address those as we go along, or at the end we'll have some dedicated time for Q&A. So ransomware and malware, that's been a big topic for a lot of years. It's still an issue, even though it's changing, and we wanted to talk about what's going on with that.
Yep.
So ransomware, one thing that I want to start with is what it is, right? And we can kind of draw a parallel to just normal real world crime. And in fact, it often crosses over those thresholds in very serious ways, which it's just basically extortion. So it's attackers, it's somebody trying to use your business information against you or your customers. And that comes in a variety of forms. In some instances, it's that they get in a foothold into your server environment, into your computer environment, and then they encrypt some of your data and then hope that you don't have a way to quickly restore that. Another thing that we see is where they try to get information like W-2s and other information out. But typically ransomware is a way to extort you and is more narrowly defined to somehow locking down your systems or your information. And we've seen a lot of cases recently where companies have gone out of business. They've paid tens of millions of dollars to restore that data. And then there was recently a case where there was a doctor's office that got hit. And not only did they go after the doctor's office for a ransom, but they started going after the patients as well, saying that we're going to release your information if you don't pay us money.
Yeah, and to that point here, another one that struck my memory when we were talking about ransomware was regarding the incident at Richmond Community Schools, where they spent, what was it, nearly $10,000 in a week down. Or no, the ransomware was put in place for a ransom of $10,000, and they had to shut down their school for a week after Christmas break in order to put themselves in a better position for that. So stuff like this, as it continues to become more sophisticated and as it continues to become a ramping threat, you can definitely see the numbers show that price tag is getting higher.
Right, that's a key point. Yeah,
and that you see the complexity behind what they design behind it better.
So I think the reason why that ransom typically is going up, and there's a lot of research that goes into this, it's important to understand that these are people that are behind these. These are organizations that are behind these. In many ways, they're making a living off from this. So there's an ever ongoing war between the organizations and people that are trying to protect you and try to protect your systems, and the people that are trying to attack and exploit you. That's not really an exaggeration at this point, and there is a lot of reason why there are countries that actually tolerate or promote this, right? Because these are resources that are valuable to them to use in actual cyber warfare. So what we're seeing is that we've gone from more of a shotgun ransomware approach to a more targeted ransomware approach. Both still exist, right? So a shotgun approach is where I write an email that looks deceptive, and some examples of that might be it's a job posting response. So it's like, here's my resume, and it's a Word document, and you have to enable macros in order to see the content is what it looks like, and then your computer gets infected. Another example would be where it's coming from someone and it's an email attachment, and this is typically where we see a lot of ransomware infections, is from email attachments. You just send it out to a big group of people. So you have a list of 100,000 email addresses you bought from online, and you just send that out to everyone. And it's generic, doesn't have any specific targeted information. So that's what we'd call a shotgun approach. You just try to blast it out there, and hopefully a few people will get it. The systems will happen automatically and immediately, and then you get a few people to pay. The problem is that the amount of people that were paying was going down, and they've started shifting to more sophisticated attacks where they're researching individual companies, and they're trying to figure out a way that they can get that in there through the salespeople, through the finance users, whatever way they can get that in. And in many cases, they sit resident for a while. So they don't attack and start encrypting immediately. They get their software into your computer systems, and then they watch and monitor for a while and try to figure out how they can cause the most damage.
Yeah, an analogy that has worked well for me in those situations is like, think about it like if you catch a bug or a virus that's been going on, right? Sometimes it lies dormant for a while for you. You're not really sure if you actually even have it in that instance, but putting in key places and making sure that you're there, once it happens, it's going to happen. So it lies dormant for a while until they find the time is right to be able to make that attack happen.
Right. So if you think back to the shotgun approach, a problem was if you're an attacker and you send out, let's say, 1 million emails and you infect 500 people, and 25 of those people end up paying your ransom. And let's say you just asked for, what price do you set, right? That's kind of the challenge. Let's say you ask for $1,000. Let's say most of those people were home users and they were willing to pay to get their photos back. But 2 or 3 of them were businesses, and you could have asked for a lot more money, right? And then that's an opportunity loss as the attacker. It's a bad business, right? You need to know how much your customer is willing to pay, unfortunately. So that's why they want to know who they got infected and try to figure out how much they can exploit for, even to the point that they try to figure out what kind of insurance coverage you have, because they just need to ask for a little bit less than how much it's going to cost you to recover. And what's happening is more people are paying. This is kind of a controversial topic in the industry, but there's almost like a feedback loop between it being a better, lower cost decision. And oftentimes cybersecurity insurance providers might recommend that you pay because it's a quicker and maybe cheaper way to get back up and running. But that success further fuels more attacks. And so they are asking way more money. I mean, we see ransom requests of $30,000, $50,000, $100,000. If they know what organization it is, it could go north of that very easily.
Yep. Yeah, one thing I want to touch base on, I'm a stats guy, so I kind of like to know some of these things here. One of the things that stuck for me was knowing this from a source from PhishMe, which said that in 2019, ransomware from phishing emails had increased about 109% between then and 2017, which essentially is important to know because you know that attack is growing in scale, it's growing in sophistication, so you got to keep a watch for that kind of stuff here for sure.
Which the issue there is oftentimes those become more targeted as well.
Yep.
They're trying to find a way to make sure that the user sees it as something that's relevant to them and likely to get them to actually click on it, which feeds directly into our number one threat.
Yep. Yeah, the biggest thing that we've ran into is definitely
Drum roll.
Yeah, somebody that's watching this, just get a drum roll going or something. Have somebody confused when they walk into your office. The biggest thing that we've seen is users. We like to say that we can build the biggest walls around everybody's environment here, but at the end of the day, a lot of the biggest threats that we've seen come from users, whether it be lack of knowledge or lack of capability, or just that the environment wasn't prepped for them enough and we left too many holes open in those instances.
Yeah, so that continues to be the number one source of breaches that occur for organizations is through user behavior and user actions. We all have bad days, and as much as we want to try to protect the users from themselves, there's no magic bullet. There's no one thing that will fix everything. But let's talk a little bit about how they exploit your users or how you yourself may get exploited. And we see this on a constant basis. And the term breach usually refers to once an attacker gets access inside your systems. And any small access oftentimes can escalate further because if they manage to log into one of your users' email addresses, for example, and send an email as that user, then it's very likely that they can get someone else inside that organization to do what they're asking them to do.
Yes.
So sometimes it's to install ransomware. Sometimes it's a very different sort of attack.
Yep. And the big thing that we've seen from us on the support side of things is that, once you click on that link, you provide those credentials information, that stuff can hit anywhere from send an email to 10 users to click on this PDF that does the same exact thing that person fell for, up to we've seen nearly 1,200 emails just produced from somebody at this time. Luckily, Office 365 has shown that they're starting to catch these trends when people start, mass sending a ton of these emails to be malicious and spamming, but doesn't obviously catch every single instance of this. So of course that threat expands as soon as they get access by one individual user, by one individual set. So, and phishing emails grow more complex as we continue to see it. It could be anything from designing a link that looks like it says, Microsoft online, but then online has an M in it. It could be as simple as just doing a completely vague site, but it looks totally like the Office 365 login. There's a ton of other possibilities that fall in line with this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about spoofing versus phishing versus spear phishing, or like actually compromised accounts and what happens from that point. So how would you define spoofing?
So I would define spoofing in a way that says, hey, let's use an example. Let's say I wanted to send an email to somebody at our marketing team and make it look like it was from you. So I'm spoofing to make it look like it's coming from Adam Deveraux at worksighted.com.
Right.
But I don't have access to that domain. So maybe I do like Worksighted and then I just like put just a T there or something. So then I send an email to our marketing department and say, I need access, or hey, can you log into this real quickly here? I'm having trouble accessing something. So I make it look like it came from you. So
it doesn't actually come from me, but it looks like it comes from me.
Exactly.
That's spoofing, right? Yep. I agree with that. I think that's one of the best ways to put it.
Yep.
And people often ask, like, how does this get through? How did they send an email as so-and-so? And oftentimes it comes from people or is addressed as or looks like it's coming from a CEO, a president, a CFO, somebody like that.
Exactly.
The problem is it's actually not coming from that user when it's spoofing. It looks like it is, and there may be subtle differences. And there's tools that you can use, which is one of the things that we talk about that you can use to try to protect yourself. Is there are tool sets that can try to catch those emails that are coming from the outside and trying to look like they're coming from the inside. But sometimes it also looks like it's coming from somebody that you may know externally as well. But that's a big difference between when they actually do have access to somebody's email and they are sending it as that person. So it's not always true that an email attack is a fake email. Sometimes it is a legitimate email.
Exactly. And that's where, using the example I provided earlier, where if somebody starts by, let's just use a silly example and say that I did click on a link and
So silly.
yeah, and logged in with my user account. Well, now they have access to that stuff.
Right.
So now they can send those emails as a part of me. So that, in a sense, is still technically spoofing, but they actually have my account, and it looks like it actually was an email that I still sent.
Yeah, your account is breached at that point, is what we refer to. And all they need to do that, typically for modern email systems, is to know your email address and your password. Which also gets to another way that users' behavior can be an issue for organizations. There's been a lot of breaches that have occurred because people reused a password. So using the same password for your business identity, for your business email that you use for other personal services, everybody knows it's not a good idea, but yet people still do it because we all have to remember so many passwords. And what can happen is that service gets hacked and the passwords get released along with the email addresses associated with it.
And it's important to remember that this isn't just like, oh, the CEO is the biggest target of it. I mean, albeit maybe you'll see more spam emails come from there, but even John Doe from the janitorial closet can still have a compromised email account that potentially could be utilized in a nefarious way. It's one door that allows us the opportunity to put somebody in our wall.
So we talked about spoofing tools, specifically like ATP for Office 365. There's third-party services that try to lock those down. For once somebody is logged in as someone, or protecting users from poor passwords, there's a couple of ways that you can protect yourself we want to talk about. One would be making sure that your users are using secure passwords. That does not mean changing frequently. At this point, that's no longer recommended because pushing people to change their password frequently actually usually makes them have less secure passwords. And it really hasn't been shown to increase security at all. But what is better is unique, longer passwords that have sufficient complexity. We do have like a passphrase recommendation would be that rather than have it be like a jumble of numbers and characters, longer, even if it doesn't have as many custom characters, actually represents a more secure cryptographic hash as well. So once it's encrypted, it's still a very complex encryption. And we have a passphrase generator on our website that you can use as an example. A couple words together. Oftentimes that's easy to remember.
Yeah, and the nice part about, and to your point, passphrases to me are a lot easier to remember, and the fact that they're more secure really puts us in a better position for that. So yeah, check out, if you're not really sure, or not really creative and want to create your own passphrases, we have a really, really nice generator on our website that you can utilize at any point in time to just put yourself together for that. But yeah, I agree. It's tough to necessarily tell a user, well, okay, you're going to change passwords every single month, because that's when people start growing disgruntled, and essentially it's not actually as effective as maybe waiting that retention period a bit longer and designing a better passphrase solution in place of that.
Yeah, and specifically Microsoft and NIST recommend that you do not set passwords to auto expire at this point. In fact, in many security reviews that are current with those recommendations, they actually will ding you if you have frequent password resets required. It's interesting. It's kind of something where that's where there's almost like this crazy story of how that became just accepted security knowledge. And that's something, it's a good example of how we have to be careful about what we trust and believe will protect us. So
the one on our screen at the moment is a good example of a good passphrase. Maybe a little bit longer,
maybe a little long, but you
times,
could take.
But that is a proof of concept, though. These are things that technically being is more secure than just writing an 8-character password with a few dollar signs and @ symbols and everything into it. So
exactly.
But the thing that I think would be important to touch base, we've talked a lot about email phishing, but there's more beyond the scope of what kind of phishing can really fall in play here. I'd like for us to kind of touch base a little bit more on the phone side of things. Talk about kind of text and phone phishing.
All right, so that's where we get into social engineering, which is an element of all phishing. And there's so many different words out there, right? Phishing, spear phishing, whaling. There's so many. People try to come up with a trendy name to describe it, but more often than not, it's a person trying to fool you or your users in some way. And they could be doing that over the phone or by text.
Mhm.
We've seen cases where that is almost the easiest to fall for. Ultimately, you kind of need to know a little bit about what you're trying to do in the organization, but that can often be a way for them to get key pieces of information or for them to log into something. They may impersonate your bank, suppliers. There's lots of ways that, even with when we look at financial systems, one way that phishing is often used, which is the voice phishing, is trying to set up ACH or change ACH information,
Mhm.
right? So this is where oftentimes you have to have policies as an organization to protect you, because you just need to make sure that for wire transfers, ACH changes, things like that, those have to go through some sort of approval and validation process.
Yes, and one of the things that stuck out to me a lot, and I know it's kind of a silly example because most of us here kind of have the claim to fame that we're totally, again, or not fall for these, but when you get called by quote unquote Microsoft, and it's some guy on the phone saying he's from Microsoft and there's a virus on your computer, that in of itself is considered voice phishing at that case. They're trying to find a way to get into your machine and potentially do things like commit ransomware, steal passwords and credentials,
Lock down your computer.
lock down your computer, force them to pay that back. We've seen cases like that before. So that in of itself, as silly as it seems and totally unbelievable,
What happens for
in the
sure.
right
Yeah.
circumstance, sometimes they make them crazy enough that if someone falls for it, they know that they're in the clear because
Yeah,
they probably got
right.
the easier target per se.
Well, and a key thing to note of the way that social engineering comes into play here is oftentimes they try to create a sense of urgency,
Mhm.
that it's coming from authority, and they try to kind of exploit people's willingness to help, right? I need your help with this quick. I need you to do this. This is really urgent because this came up, and they try to create this urgency and this reason
Yeah.
for you to kind of shut down some of the parts of your brain that would say, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't seem quite right.
Like, for example, one of the ones that we've seen frequently is someone will send an email and it might be from like a higher up, like let's say, the CEO or somebody that's management of your company, they spoof to look like that person and say, hey, this is important. I need you to like go get gift cards. Gift cards are kind of a big thing, or, I need you to do a favor is a lot of what we've seen behind here.
Yeah, and we've seen seasonal attacks. So it's
Yep.
based around health enrollment season. They'll ask for W-2 information.
Mhm.
We've seen it, and like there's real world examples where organizations here in Michigan have fallen for email spoofs or email once a key person's been compromised, that they're trying to get a wire transfer to happen, and it has, and losses in the six figures.
Oh yeah.
In many cases. And so we do have some tech rifts out there, because really the key point here is, what can you do about user behavior?
Mhm.
And there are ways that you can try to make them more wary, right? So that's the goal, is we want to make our users more wise to the ways of the world, right?
Exactly.
And so we have some tech riff videos on our YouTube channel that you could check out, that talk about how phishing works, the psychology of it, and what are some tools and platforms that you can use to try to train users to not be gullible, essentially.
Exactly.
So user awareness training is a key feature, a key reason why that you can try to protect your environment. But that being said, as wary as you can make your users, everybody has a bad day where we're stressed, we're tired,
Yep.
we're dealing with a bunch of other things, and we just click and do something without thinking about it. In some cases, they're trying to exploit a very specific vector, like an email that when it comes up on your phone, it's really hard to tell that it's not
Yep.
legitimate. There's ways that they try to make it so even somebody who's smart is going to fall for it.
Yeah, this is a good time to kind of talk about how we can properly protect users. Because again, we can make users master's degrees and understanding how phishing can work, but there is still going to be those one or two rare occurrences. So let's start with how we should properly protect an organization. What can be some tools and some utilization methods we can use to help users in this circumstance?
Right. So let's say that an attacker has one of your users' passwords and email address, whether they clicked on a link in an email and it popped up and asked them for it and they put it in, or they were reusing a password, or however that happened.
Yep.
One of the best ways that you can protect yourself, one of the only ways that's really the most effective tool, is using multi-factor authentication.
Yes.
So if they had your password and they were trying to log in as you, if you didn't have MFA, that's generally all they need to get access to your email address. But if you do have multi-factor authentication turned on, they're missing another piece of information. They're missing another key thing that has to be there for that person to log into your email.
Yeah, and especially in this environment right now, as we've noticed common tendencies, 9 times out of 10, they very likely will not account for somebody having a multi-factor authentication. When you see those fake Microsoft links, or you see those fake links that pop up here, most of the time they don't account for multi-factor authentication, which at that point you're practically in the clear, because yeah, maybe your account was compromised, but they can't necessarily execute the damage they want to put behind the account here.
Yeah, I would say generally it's almost generally impossible to get around multi-factor authentication.
Yep.
There are a few unique edge cases where they try to spoof the MFA page or something along those lines, but those are very sophisticated attacks for the vast majority of organizations out there.
Yeah.
If you have an MFA system in place, and in fact, they're getting much more advanced, and the future looks like it's going to be passwordless in a way too. So your users don't even have passwords to get into these systems. Multi-factor is one of our strongest recommendations to protect your business information from outside attackers. And it takes a lot of different forms. It could be that multi-factor sends a push to your phone and you approve it through your phone. Everybody's using it these days for like your bank accounts, where you have to put in an SMS code, or you get some sort of verification that you have to approve of to validate that computer.
Yeah.
But the challenge there is it can be difficult. It can cost money. So how do we make sure that we get the best value out of that? And that's where we go back to that business identity, and kind of the future of cloud security is where you're really putting effort into securing your user's business identity, but then you're using that business identity to log into the other applications and systems that your users need to access. So rather than having 10 different MFA codes and in this complex login issue, you have one login, very secure. You're using advanced systems that monitor all the login attempts and looking at all the information. And then you're using that to get into the other apps and information repositories.
Yep. And of course, as we start wrapping up here for our webinar, one of the big things is that if you ever have any additional questions beyond what we covered today, feel free to bring these up with your sales rep. Feel free to bring these up with your account executives here. Just start that conversation to put you guys in better optimal situations. If you feel like, oh, are we covered for this particular thing? Should we start having that conversation if we haven't already had it? Or maybe we did have that conversation, and maybe this is kind of our last push to put us in there. Those are important details to know, because having a secure baseline helps keep your company running at the best of its capabilities.
And it's an ongoing journey. It's an ongoing conversation.
Yep.
Security threats change. The tools that we use to protect are going to change as well. So it's really important as an organization to have a security mindset and be thinking about these things, because it's too easy to act like a teenager and think, well, that's never going to happen to me. I mean, there's so many examples right here, even in West Michigan. There's I believe it was an ENT office in Battle Creek that closed their doors after they got hit by ransomware.
Yep.
There's so many organizations that have gotten exploited through phishing attacks. And in many cases, you're never going to hear about it. If they don't think that information was compromised, a lot of organizations may never go public with the attacks that they've experienced. And so by some estimates, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry in terms of what attackers are getting, and that just keeps fueling more and more attacks. So there's a lot we could say. I mean, we could have really dove a lot deeper into anything, but we are really at the end of what the main points we wanted to make, and talk about what questions you guys may have. We do have a few security partners specifically. So Worksighted is really also trying to work on our security approach and mindset. We are not a dedicated security firm in that we do only security and only assessments, but trying to bring a practical operational IT mindset and understanding what are key things that you can do to protect yourself. And there are other resources and other companies that are doing a fantastic job with that as well, that we can help work with. But these are some specific tools that we use or we recommend to help make sure that your environment is secure.
Yeah, definitely. So as we start wrapping up here, of course, we're ready to hear a couple of questions from you guys on something that we can touch base from today's webinar to wrap things up. And
so we have Rebecca here. We didn't introduce her at the beginning. I forgot about that. Rebecca is on our marketing team, and she is kind of the brains behind everything that's going on.
She's the one who clicks all of the buttons.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. couple of you have asked if we are going to send out the slides and a recording of the meeting. Yes, absolutely. I've got all your emails from your registration, and I will be sending those out. Feel free to ask questions in that little Q&A box. I don't think I've seen any yet, so feel free to pop in there.
Yeah, and apologies for the technical difficulties. We were going good through rehearsal this morning, and then the live event platform we were using ran into a technical difficulty, seems, at their end. So we had to make a last-minute switch, but we thank you for kind of putting through that and getting here with us today anyway.
Yeah, definitely. And it was definitely enjoyable to engage in a conversation about security because like we alluded to before, this is an ever-changing landscape. And, you know, things that we may even bring up, like we could jokingly say that we could do another webinar about this next year and have 3 entirely different concepts potentially.
Yeah, potentially so.
It definitely is that.
All right, we do have some questions coming in. Wendy asks, are there examples, websites, or other options for sending to users to test phishing attacks and educate them?
Yes, and in fact, we are currently probably switching some ways that or tools that we use for that as well. There's really more than one provider. KnowBe4 is a fantastic provider that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
But the key thing is if you use a phish test or security awareness tool, then it's really important to make sure that it's actively managed and that somebody is really championing that. And in some cases, we run into problems where it doesn't really have the authority behind it. So it takes really an organizational buy-in to make sure that the managers, the HR, everyone else is kind of on board with this being something that's really important and a key part of your curriculum as an organization. Because if you, for example, are sending out these training links that people need to register for and log in and take that training, and they're just like, I don't have time for it. Well, what are you going to do at that point as an organization? So you need to make sure that that's something that you really have a strategy behind and the whole organization buys into.
Yeah, and even engaging in an important meeting to discuss some of the common traits that you've noticed here or provide some examples, you know, have that communication internally with your team, put everybody on board. Those are also general first-party stuff that you can do. And then we have some third-party stuff like, you know, one of our things right now is KnowBe4, and we're still deploying that out to clients at this time to go through some user training as examples here. But as it's constantly evolving here, it's always recommended that, you know, engaging in those conversations with your personnel are important as well, because sometimes telling your marketing person that security is definitely important, they're not going to listen to you at the first time. So giving them some proven examples might help vindicate why exactly this should happen.
I'm not sure why you're dogging on marketing so much. Taking personal offense to that.
I don't think I have anything to say about that.
It was just
a general example.
Exactly.
Great. We've got another question from Mark. Any Mac specific attacks your team has heard about?
When you look at exploits, you know, the Mac environment typically has been a smaller vector, but there certainly have been some malware viruses that have had success in the Mac world. Apple typically is fairly active with that. I think that as far as like phishing, oftentimes they're not going to necessarily know that you're accessing from a Mac. So they're more trying to exploit the services that your users are using. A good example of that is if you're using Google apps or you're using Office 365, a lot of the phishing emails that get sent out try to look like some sort of official Google app or Office 365 login or email address. And whether you're an Outlook on the Mac, Outlook on the PC, Outlook on the web, for example, it could look really convincing and fool you. So it's, you know, when we talk about the different sectors of these security concerns that we have, phishing isn't as much PC or Mac specific. When we go back to ransomware and malware, there are specific PC or Mac variants. I would say the general adage that there's less viruses tends to still be true in the Mac world, but there have been some notable exceptions in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and that's just kind of touching on what we talked about before with outdated systems. I mean, you can still keep your system out of date, and Apple does keep a pretty proactive listing of how they manage their security. Well, that doesn't mean that you still don't have, you know, Joe Schmo who's, you know, hasn't upgraded their system in 3 years or something, as an example, and that
Yeah.
there was a key security flaw they found, and they've never patched it since then.
Well, and Macs typically have a longer life. People will use them for a longer period of time, but you really have to be careful if you're using an older operating system. So if your Mac
Yep.
is no longer able to upgrade to the newest Mac OS, that can be a concern.
Mhm.
But really, this reminds me of something that I wanted to talk about a little bit before too, which is in regards to disaster recovery. And there's a NIST framework that's called, which NIST is a governmental body that really is involved in security, that they call Identify, Protect, Detect, Respond, and Recover. And this is kind of a general framework for how you can think about what area these different tools fall in, and do you have protections in each of those areas. So identify is where you want to identify what you need to protect and identify threats. Protect is where you protect via various systems that have active protection, and respond and recover. And the key thing I just wanted to talk about was the recover part. So whether you're a personal home user or your business, you need to make sure that you have a backup and disaster recovery strategy in place. And I'll just say, based on the time frame that we have right now, the most important thing is to make sure that you have a disaster recovery strategy that takes into consideration the types of threats that are out there. Make sure that the disaster recovery system and plan itself is protected from those, and that it's tested and you know that you're able to recover in a time frame that you have documented. Because there's always a cost, there's almost always information loss when you talk about recovery, whether it's a day or a couple days. There's a cost to that, and that's something that's better to map that out and understand up front what recovering from a major disaster looks like than to find out in the midst of a major disaster.
Yeah, the way I've thought about this with people before is, if you find out that it costs you $2,000 to prevent a $10,000 attack, would you not want to invest into that kind of infrastructure?
Yeah, I would ramp that up, right? If it would cost you $20,000 or $200,000 to protect you from $1 million or $10 million cost, and that's not really an exaggeration, because typically the impact of a major problem is always more expensive than what you think up front. It's always more difficult to recover. It always takes longer to recover. Most organizations would go, I think we could be back up in a day.
Right.
And so often the reality is 3, 4, 5 days to try to get back up to full operational
And what's your
state.
net revenue in that day?
The impact to reputation can be
Yep.
incalculable in some cases. Yeah.
Yep.
So that's a main point that I forgot to talk about before, but that we want to continuously stress: disaster recovery, because a disaster can include security breaches as well.
Yep.
We did have a question on, I think you guys touched on this, but on the controversial topic of paying ransomware.
Yes.
Especially with the growth of the extortion component to leak data, in which then others' data is more at risk, and now breach notification law comes into play. So that's a really big question. We only have a few minutes. So what's your 1 minute response to that?
I would say a summarized version of it is that the intent is that you want to avoid paying that ransom as best as possible. But sometimes businesses will make the assessment and say, well, if I spend $50,000 now to get allegedly get my data back, maybe that's the better solution. So that's, again, touching base on the proactive versus reactive side of things.
Right.
Creating those disaster recovery strategies and implementations is how you save yourself from needing to spend that $50,000 that's needed for that disaster recovery. Putting yourself in a position that at the very least you're going to be able to make recoveries and get yourself back as quick as possible is going to be a better focus.
Know that you can recover,
Yep.
Know what it's going to cost you to recover and how long it's going to take. Don't put yourself in a position where you could have to pay the ransom.
Yep.
But the reality is, in the business world, and the larger the business is, typically this is more likely true, what's the primary decision maker justification? It comes down to money, right? So if it's cheaper to pay the ransom, that a lot of businesses are going to end up doing that, and that's the reality that we're seeing. And it is controversial, because there are some reports coming out that are seeing that as almost like a cycle, where because insurance companies are oftentimes recommending that the ransom be paid, then that's driving more attacks. I think the research is not necessarily conclusive, but the reality is that there are many cases that individual actions, selfish actions, are right for the person, but bad for the overall kind of economy or global business world.
Yep.
And this is another example of that.
Exactly. Do you have any other questions? All right. Well, we thank everybody.
Well, we got a few things here.
Yes. Thank you.
Next webinar, we're going to be doing February 27th. And we're going to be talking about cloud storage. So we don't have our official title yet, but we're going to talk about what's happening with cloud storage right now, cloud file storage, kind of the pros and cons, what it really works well for, or what areas perhaps there are still challenges. And then we're also having a live security event on March 5th at Terra Square, which is in Hudsonville. Yep. And that will be a security event as well. So again, we're going to be looking at monthly for these webinars. So after the 27th, we'll always let you know ahead of time what the next date is going to be. And we thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and just one little note before we run away too. If you guys feel like you want us to address a specific topic or discussion that would be worthwhile in a webinar, feel free to contact us or contact.
And how should they contact us?
Well,
Becca?
That is a perfect question.
You'll see on the screen my email, becca@worksighted.com is the best way to do that. So I'll also follow up an email with the recording, with the slides, as well as a link for suggesting topics for future webinars. So
All right, great. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Boom, boom, boom.